Por isso temos Vanessa Andreotti connosco neste momento, é doutorada em Educação, Teoria Crítica e Estudos Culturais pela Universidade de Nottingham, é atualmente professora do Departamento de Estudos Educacionais da Faculdade de Educação na Universidade de British Columbia, em Vancouver, no Canadá. Possui uma ampla experiência internacional em projetos colaborativos interdisciplinares, nas áreas da educação, estudos sobre o desenvolvimento, teoria política e sociologia, com enfoque sobretudo na cidadania global. Os seus atuais interesses de pesquisa envolvem internacionalização, educação global, cidadania global, educação indígena, teoria pós-coloniais e pós-estruturalistas na educação. Muito mais haveria a dizer, mas vamos aproveitar o tempo ouvindo a Vanessa. Obrigada, Vanessa.
Primeiramente, gostaria de agradecer o convite de estar aqui em Portugal. Eu cheguei ontem, não consegui dormir no avião, então estou um pouquinho jet lag, são 8 horas de diferença. Agradecer a presença de vocês e agradecer a fala da professora Luísa, que foi excelente. Muito obrigada. E vai dar, então, uma base também para a minha fala. Eu vou falar em inglês, a apresentação formal, mas eu gostaria de chamar a atenção para 3 apresentações que estão no YouTube em português, sobre internacionalização e cidadania global. E essas apresentações aconteceram, então, no contexto da minha visita ao Brasil, à Unicamp. Elas falam para o contexto brasileiro, mas elas estão em português. Falam um pouquinho da pesquisa, os desafios da internacionalização e falam também sobre um curso. São 3 palestras. Ali do lado vocês vão ver as outras 2. A terceira fala sobre um curso sobre ideais de cidadania global que eu dei no Brasil, que entra bastante na questão da complexidade que a Luísa estava falando e coloca algumas pontuações dos alunos mesmo dentro da apresentação. Então, eu vou pedir desculpa, mas eu vou ter que passar para o inglês, porque, na verdade, em Educação para Desenvolvimento, eu tenho dificuldade em falar em português, porque a maioria do meu trabalho foi em inglês. Mas eu estou aprendendo, reaprendendo. Então, quando o Jorge nos perguntou sobre as questões que a gente gostaria de abordar para poder fazer uma interligação entre as falas. Vou passar para o inglês. When George asked us to talk about the questions we wanted to approach in order to connect the different speakers, these were the questions that I suggested. So, how is social change imagined differently by different social groups? What are the dissenting silences in our DE conversations? And how can we expand our frames of reference in or through development education? I'm going to try to just share some reflections with you about each of them that are part of the current work that I'm doing now in Canada. So the first thing I would like to start with is something that called my attention yesterday on the plane. Somebody by my side was looking at the British Airways magazine, plane magazine, and I looked with the corner of my eye and I saw global citizenship there. So I took the magazine and I started looking for it to see what it was about. And this is what I found. So it was an advert for a company saying global citizenship, CS, global partnership story. And I'm going to try to read what it said for you, because I think it's too small. So it says, guiding business people and international families towards prosperity, mobility, and financial security through second citizenship in other places like the Dominican Republic, Grenada, and other smaller places. So thinking about the imaginary for social change, even for the elites that are going to understand global citizenship in this manner, we're already seeing people seeing the signs of major global crisis and the need to protect themselves by having a second citizenship in a place that wouldn't be affected by this crisis, which I thought was really, really interesting. I had never thought of global citizenship this way. I didn't think they would go that far, that quick. But part of my work right now has been about mapping these understandings. And as part of this mapping exercise, I have come to 3 different kinds of imaginaries of global change. And imaginaries are different from ideologies because they contain ideologies. They contain many ideologies. So back to the idea of complex thinking, imaginaries are about the structure that makes ideologies and certain questions and certain answers possible. So the first imaginary of social change I would like to talk about, which is different from the first one that I presented to you, the one of the advert, is an imaginary of social reform. And by far in Canada, this is the imaginary that is most prevalent in the context of higher education that I work in. So soft reform is about making the same world a little bit better through personal transformation and individual action. So you would have a lot of people talking about recycling, helping, being a hero for other communities. It is individually focused, the analysis, there are analyses, but they are simplistic analysis. There's a single story of progress and development. There are simple solutions. These solutions are self-affirming. It's the idea of making a difference and feeling good about things. And there's a lot of comfort in these stories. So here I classified and I discerned it from different imaginaries as asking the same questions and going back to the same answers. The next imaginary that I see of social change is an imaginary of radical reform. So the idea here is to make the same world a lot better by including more people, more voices, more perspectives in collective action. So here you would hear a lot about reducing, rethinking, including other people. Here we have more systemic and historical analysis. We have multiple perspectives. We have perspectives that self-implicate, as Luisa was talking about, that say, okay, we're working against injustice, but we're also part of reproducing injustices. We have more complex solutions, and we have some discomfort. So here we are asking the same questions, but looking at different answers. And the next imaginary that I'm really interested in is the imaginary that goes beyond reform. So this imaginary is about disinvesting in the current unsustainable world and walking with others into the possibility of new worlds. So here it would be about imagining what we at this point perceive as impossible. So here we have systemic and historical analysis taking a step further. We have the idea of realizing the false promises and contradictions of modernity. And here we have also the idea of comfort with discomfort. So the idea is to ask different questions so that we can talk about different answers. Now, in terms of the talk with Boaventura yesterday, which I didn't see, but I talked to some people about, radical reform would be different or alternative ideas of development versus beyond reform, which would be more about alternatives to development. But we do have a lot of difficulties, as also Luisa pointed out, with beyond reform ideals, because we're still not completely in a holistic sense, but we're still very invested in the comforts and the benefits that the system still gives us. So the paradox here would be about wanting a system that is harmful to others. And because we can't see an alternative, thinking that there's none. But there are alternatives. They are not perfect. There are people working towards alternatives. And what the beyond reform imaginary, I think, indicates, it's that it's not necessarily that alternatives provide a solution, but it is the experiment with alternatives and the failure of these experiments and the attention we have to the learning that happens through these failures that actually create the basis for something new. So I'm going to explore this a little bit more in the idea of dissenting silences. So I've been using quite a lot, if you know my work, the analogy of corn to talk about plurality and multiplicity. So I'll bring it back here. So I ask people to imagine a field of corn, and generally people imagine a field of yellow corn cobs. And I show them this picture, and they say, no, we haven't seen this corn before unless you're from Peru or from other parts of the Andes. And I talk about the idea that we've been colonized, our imaginaries have been colonized by the yellow corn cob. So our ways of thinking about education as schooling, about security, about relationships, about contracts, about all kinds of institutions are colonized by one single story of doing things, one single story of progress, development, human evolution. And that has implications for how we see other corn cobs. But here I would like to bring Boaventura back and talk about what he mentions as abyssal thinking, pensamento abissal. And what he says when he's talking about that is that it's not about what we don't imagine, but about what we can't imagine. So the idea of having the imagination colonized by one form of story means that we need to get to the edge of the story and understand we don't understand what's beyond that story. And because we don't understand what's beyond our stories, it doesn't mean there's nothing there. It just means we don't understand. So dwelling or struggling at the edge of this imaginary means that we need to start to think about alternatives in a different way. So again, Boaventura de Souza Santos says we need an alternative way to think about alternatives that doesn't recode what is different into what we believe is the same, or what we don't even know we believe is the same. So here I'm going to give you an example from a project from Finland that is funded by the Finnish Academy on Internationalization. And this is just, I'll give you 3 examples. This is just the first of them. So when we were looking at perceptions of internationalizations in higher education in 30 universities, what we found in their policies was that the internationalization for the global knowledge economy, which is the biggest one there, was the most prevalent. So most internationalization policies of higher education are now focusing on improving individual or a country economic advantage in knowledge societies. They are focusing on income generation, addressing the deficit generated by government defunding of higher education. The institutional driver is branding, prestige, performance, and productivity. And the main personal motivation to internationalize is the aggregated value of the CVs of students or faculty and the differential in competitive environments in the global sphere. Now, we also found in this policy some signs of an older imaginary of internationalization, which is the imaginary of internationalization for the public good. So this imaginary is about democratizing global access to modern institutions, expanding opportunities for social mobility, making the dominant system fairer and more inclusive, equitable balance between foreign and local students, advancing democratic ideals, so on and so forth. So these 2 imaginaries were actually present in the policies. Now, what we were really interested in was not what was necessarily present in the policies, but what was absent. What are the absent dissenting voices in these discussions? And the first one that we found, and then we put it smaller because we really didn't find any example in the policies, but we found examples happening in pockets at the university. For example, in my university, the example of this would be the anti-oppressive internationalization would be our students. There's a group of students working with communities in Guatemala who have been affected by mining companies in Canada. Now, the interesting thing is that when these students wanted to bring these communities to Canada to talk about this, some universities decided to censor it because the universities are being funded by the mining companies. Right? So how can you be funded by the mining companies and bring people from Guatemala talking about the negative impact Canada has on communities in Guatemala? So this is an example of internationalization based on anti-oppressive an anti-oppressive imaginary. So this is about working in partnership with oppressed people, working in solidarity, and trying to create an environment that is fairer for more people. But there's also another imaginary that is absent in this discussion, which is the imaginary that doesn't focus on human beings. So here we found some universities in Latin America that are working from indigenous perspectives that center the land instead of centering human struggles. And this is something also much more difficult to find both in policy and in practices of internationalization in higher education. Now, I have two examples of this that I'm going to show you. The first is the Apu Chupacpata Global Education Center in Peru. And this is their understanding of education. I'm not going to read it for you, but based on the Quechua ontology, what they do is they center the planet, they center the earth, rather than centering human beings. It's relational, it's non-anthropocentric, it's non-teleological, it's non-dialectical, it's non-Cartesian. And it offers a very different understanding of what it means to exist in the planet. The other example that I would like just to show is the Shishkantar Andolan movement. It's Manish Kumar. He spoke in School in the World, and he has this document online as a copyleft text, as a manifesto for education. So in his manifesto, he focuses more on the critique of capitalist and nationalistic structures and proposing what we would need to disinvest in order to invest or to start to create the possibility for imagining something else. So I'll just read a couple. I can no longer accept a narrative of education that teaches me that my village grandmother was illiterate, primitive, backward, stupid, uneducated, underdeveloped, uncivilized, and not capable of managing her own affairs. I'll read the last one. That learning is a commodity along with the air, water, land, and food, and that knowledge is the property of individuals through copyrights and patents. So you can see that, you can find it online, and you can see that their critique is extremely sharp in identifying the harmful aspects of the current system. So in order to expand the frames of reference in DE, we would need to think about things in very different ways. But if we're starting from the simplistic imaginary or the simplistic thinking that Mohan talks about, to go to a more complex thinking, we have to start to discern between what we have been doing and what we haven't done yet. So here I have a number of different approaches that I have found up to today in documents related to global citizenship education that are official documents, like the UNESCO document that was published in 2014. So you have empowerment, leadership, consensus, progress, national identity, dialogue, innovation, affluence, competition, speed, making a difference to others, and the concept of separability. There is the other over there. And here's what I found working with indigenous communities and looking at indigenous literature about the possibility of starting, of creating the possibility of starting to imagine otherwise. So instead of empowerment, we have disarmament. Instead of leadership, we have decentering. Instead of consensus, pluriversalities. Instead of progress, remembering, both in terms of remembering with our memories, but remembering in terms of putting members back together, members that were dismembered back together. Planetarity, listening and presencing each other rather than just talking. Wisdom rather than innovation, giveaway rather than affluence, complementarity, taking time, becoming useful to the world under othered terms, and entanglement. So this requires a lot of humility that generally in development education is not something we talk much about. And I'm not saying that here one is better than the other. I'm saying that we've tried one very well without understanding the possibility of another. And we need both. It's not about either or, but both and more. So in order to finalize, education for alternative futures, which is what I call it now. I don't care if it's called global citizenship development education, popular education. It doesn't really matter what the title is. What matters is the content or the substance that in the contextualization of the title. For me, it's education for alternative futures, for the possibility of alternative futures. So this kind of education is not about charity, help, or heroism, but about justice in acts, thoughts, emotions, and relationships. It's about losing the fear of feeling our shared vulnerability and of taking collective responsibility for the well-being of interconnected life forms in one finite planet, facing unprecedented multiple crises. Now, I'll just finish with the last slide in terms of challenges of intelligibility. I've been using it to talk about the different kinds of obstacles, I guess, it's not an obstacle, but maybe challenge is the best word, that I have in terms of the different audiences I'm asked to speak to. So I've used the metaphor of the beach to talk about the idea of splashing, floating, ducking, and diving. Splashing are people who are just starting to deal with these issues, or they want to just identify the issues and be inspired to do something about them. And there are desires that come with this audience, and they are desires not to be overwhelmed. So for development education practitioners, or even for any kind of education practitioner, speaking to an audience that is just approaching an issue requires a reduction of complexity so that you can help them take the next step, which I would call floating. So they need to learn to float before they learn to dive. Floating is about implementing solutions. So by far, this is the audience in Canada that I'm asked to speak the most. They just want to see how they can change policy and change practice so that on Monday, things are going to be different. Again, this is very much informed by the simplistic thinking that Louisa has been talking about. And when we talk to this audience, there's also a desire for things to be comfortable and implementable and practical so that on Monday we know what to do. The next level of swimming in this beach is the idea of facing complexities, not turning our back to complexities. And here people are ducking, just putting their head above the water. And there's a lot of fear of drowning there because the waters below are murkier, they're not as clear. And here, most of my work in graduate education, postgraduate studies, goes into helping people be okay with not having final answers for everything, understanding that we need to think in a very different way. We need to be comfortable with the paradoxes and our own self-implications in the issues that we are dealing with. And we have to have a very good look at our self-image and why the desires that are informing why we want to do things for others or for the world. And diving, I think I put it there, it is about working with impossibilities. So losing the fear that we can have the solutions for tomorrow, or that we can instrumentalize any theory or any community or put that responsibility on them to have the solution for us, but looking at the past to understand the mistakes we have made so far in order to make different mistakes in the future. So learning to walk together, to make these different mistakes, and to fail together, but fail better in trying to make the world different. So I'll just finish with that metaphor, because I feel that more and more spaces for diving, in higher education at least, are being reduced. There's much, at least in my context in Canada, there's much more push towards floating. And I believe the field itself has a responsibility to go into diving, to look at dissenting voices, to see how it can expand our frames for reference if we're going to actually be relevant in the current context of crisis we have today. So I think that's it. Thank you very much.